Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway, and we're recording this at 14 hours GMT on Friday, the 3rd of September. The European Union and AstraZeneca end their bitter legal row over COVID vaccine supplies. There's been fierce fighting in Afghanistan as the Taliban try to end resistance in the Panjshir Valley. And an Islamist stabs 6 people at a supermarket in New Zealand despite being under police surveillance. Also in the podcast,
there's no more that this group of players could do in the fight against racism, and other people have got to take the right action to try and make progress.
After ugly scenes in Hungary, can football do more to combat racial abuse? Europe's COVID vaccine rollout at the start of the year was overshadowed by a bitter dispute between the EU and AstraZeneca over supplies. Now, with countries like Spain and France catching up and even overtaking the UK in immunisation rates, the two sides have buried the hatchet. The European Commission and the British-Swedish drug maker say they reached an agreement on the delivery of the 200 million doses still outstanding. I heard more about the row from our Europe correspondent, Nick Beake.
It was certainly bitter, also complicated, technical at times, but in simple terms, it focused on this belief here in Brussels that AstraZeneca, the British-Swedish company, was favouring the United Kingdom unlawfully over European countries when it came to the delivery of vaccines. And as you say, legal action was initiated by Brussels, by the European Commission. It got very nasty. It wasn't at first directly related to Brexit, but it certainly took place in the shadow of Brexit. It was just weeks after the United Kingdom had finally, fully and formally left the rules and regulations of the EU's club. And so we've seen this legal action, but now today it seems peace has broken out. The two sides issuing similar statements saying that they've come to this arrangement that 200 million doses will be delivered by AstraZeneca to EU countries by the end of March next year. And also, interestingly, AstraZeneca saying that if any deliveries are late, there will be a partial refund for those consignments.
Of course, at the start of the year, it was a fraught time for European politicians, but now that's changed, I guess, as Europe has caught up with its vaccination.
I think that's fair to say, actually, yeah, that the heat has gone out of this. If we cast our minds back to the start of the year, it was, in the midst of a second wave of infections, a time of second lockdowns or severe restrictions across European countries. And if you contrast that with the news this week from the European Commission that they've hit their target of vaccinating 70% of the adult population of the EU, you kind of see that the facts have changed, but also that the tone has changed. Although, they're pleased with the vaccination rate, they do vary across the 27 EU countries quite considerably.
And briefly, are they happy using AstraZeneca now? Because, of course, Emmanuel Macron once called it quasi-ineffective.
He did, yeah. He was talking about the elderly in particular, and he made those comments just hours before the European Medicines Agency ruled that all adults in Europe would be able to receive it. As it turned out, as we know, there were concerns over the use of the jab in younger people, the possible links with very rare blood clots. And so, to this day, in some countries, it's not given to, say, the under 40s, but worth reminding ourselves that the EU drugs regulators made very clear that the benefits far outweigh the risks of this particular jab. So I think most people are pretty pleased with what's been agreed today.
Nick Beake in Brussels. Now, it withstood the might of the Soviet army in the 1980s and repelled Islamists in the 1990s. Now, the Panjshir Valley is the final territory in Afghanistan holding out against the Taliban. Several thousand militiamen and former Afghan army soldiers are dug in under the leadership of Ahmed Massoud, son of the legendary Ahmed Shah Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir. Joining them is the former Afghan Vice President Amrullah Saleh. The National Resistance Front, as they're known, say the Taliban tried to enter the valley but were repulsed.
The Taliban movement launched their largest offensive last night, and they thought that they could subdue the province before they announced their new government. However, fortunately, the attacks were repelled. They suffered heavy casualties last night. They retreated from many districts in Parwan province, Kapisa province.
National Resistance Front spokesman Ali Nazari. The Taliban say they inflicted heavy casualties on their opponents. I got the latest on the fighting from our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette in Kabul.
Well, as someone who's been covering these wars and battles for many years in Afghanistan, I can safely say that the opposing sides always give a mix of facts and fabrications, and it's probably no different this time. You've got two very defiant fighting forces. I have to say the odds seem to be against the thousands holding out in the Panjshir. They're said to be very well stocked. One of their leaders, on the civilian side, Amrullah Saleh, is one of the most vociferous critics of the Taliban. I've known him for decades, and he's never, ever had a good word to say about them. It is impossible for him to surrender to the Taliban. Ahmed Massoud, the son of the legendary commander, has a huge family reputation to defend. He must feel the hand of his father upon him. He has said in comments that he would be willing to negotiate a way out so as not to fight to the finish, but there's no sign that those talks have succeeded because he too cannot be seen to surrender. Meanwhile, the Taliban, who are already boasting that they control more of Afghanistan than they did in the 1990s, want to be able to say they control the length and breadth of this country before they announce their government. So it's going to be a race, if you like, between the Taliban political side wanting to announce a government and the military side wanting to crush this last resistance. And I think we're going to have a lot of stories of fighting and casualties for a bit of time to come.
And it seems that the Taliban are keen to announce that government soon. We've seen a couple of names emerging of people who might be in it. Meanwhile, the EU and Britain say they won't recognise the new government of the Taliban. But at the same time, the Russian president saying the sooner the Taliban enters the community of civilised nations, the easier it will be to talk to them. So take us through that.
Well, we often use this phrase, the international community. There is no like-minded community when it comes to Afghanistan and pretty well on any other global issue right now. It is clear that the West is setting a very high bar when it comes to inclusive government in Afghanistan, when it comes to the rights of women and girls. But you saw that Security Council resolution, China and Russia abstained. Their main interest is in a stable and secure Afghanistan, and Afghanistan where they can pursue their own interests, use their own influence. And then, of course, there is also the Muslim world, and most of all, the jihadis who have been celebrating this victory of the Taliban and seeing it as striking a blow against the American empire. They're also going to be watching what kind of compliance with Islamic Sharia law that unfolds in Afghanistan. I don't think everyone will not have a choice. The Taliban won. They feel they are the victors, and everyone who wants to engage with them will have to engage on Taliban terms.
Lise Doucette in Kabul. An Islamic State-inspired attacker has managed to carry out a knife attack on a supermarket in New Zealand despite being under police surveillance. The Sri Lankan national, who was on a terror watch list, was shot dead by undercover officers within 60 seconds, but he managed to wound 6 shoppers. 3 are in a critical condition. New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern described it as a terrorist attack. Shaima Khalil has been following developments.
An eyewitness said the supermarket was a scene of chaos and hysteria. Online footage showed people fleeing before the sound of gunshots could be heard. The attacker, who has not been named, reportedly took a large knife from a display cabinet in the supermarket and stabbed 6 people. 3 are in critical condition. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, said the man was inspired by the so-called Islamic State terrorist group. Police killed him within 60 seconds of the attack.
What happened today was despicable. It was hateful. It was wrong. It was carried out by an individual, not a faith, not a culture, not an ethnicity, but an individual person who was gripped by ideology that is not supported here by anyone or any community.
The attacker had been under round-the-clock monitoring due to concerns about his ideology. He became a person of national security interest in 2016 and had been on a terror watch list. Questions have been raised about why action against him was not taken before 6 people were injured. The police commissioner, Andrew Coster, said it was impossible to be physically close to someone all the time.
The reality is that when you are surveilling someone on a 24/7 basis, it is not possible to be immediately next to them at all times. The staff intervened as quickly as they could, and they prevented further injury in what was a terrifying situation.
Mr. Coster added that the attacker was aware of being monitored and that the teams needed to maintain a distance to be effective. Authorities are confident he was acting alone and that there is no further danger.
Shaima Khalil in Sydney. When the Islamic State group declared its caliphate in parts of Syria and Iraq, the full horror of its actions became clear when it posted videos of Western hostages being beheaded. One victim was the American journalist James Foley. On Thursday, his mother Diane came face-to-face with the former IS member who killed him in 2014. She was in court in the US state of Virginia, where Alexander Cote from Britain pleaded guilty to multiple charges over the murder of 4 US hostages, including Mr. Foley. His mother still doesn't know where her son's remains are. She spoke to my colleague Michelle Hussain about coming face-to-face with Cote.
It was rather chilling to be there. It's the first time we've ever seen him in person. You know, just the fact that he was pleading guilty to all 8 counts was quite amazing, really.
Did he look at you?
Briefly. He knew we were present. We were introduced and, yeah, he knew we were there.
Was there any kind of acknowledgement? Did you feel that in the course of him pleading guilty there was anything that he would say directly to you?
Not really. It was pretty matter of fact from his point of view. He had obviously made up his mind this was his best chance of ever getting home to the United Kingdom at some point, or he just, felt it was what he needed to do. So I'm glad that he did, in fact, plead guilty. And it is my hope that he will spend the rest of his life behind bars without ever having parole. I almost think, to be honest, a quick martyrdom is too easy a way out of what he has committed. I was always against the death penalty.
Is there a way that you could imagine him making amends? Is there a way that you think that is possible?
I don't know. I mean, that's up to him. I didn't get any indication that he was interested in that. But I would hope that in time he might, just because the extent of the evil he's committed is just, I don't know how any soul could live with all that. But that's just my opinion.
This guilty plea has come at the same time as the events in Afghanistan, and particularly how we know now that there is an IS affiliate which is resurgent in that country. What is the effect of that on you?
Very sobering, so sobering to think that the horror of this terrorism is continuing. It certainly hasn't stopped. And I fear there's the potential for much more hostage taking. They love to use the horror of that to, frighten us and manipulate other governments and raise funds for their evil works. So I'm very sobered by that. Very sad.
Diane Foley, mother of James Foley, talking to Michelle Hussain. International football has returned this week with a series of World Cup qualifiers. Here in Europe, England enjoyed a comfortable 4-0 victory over Hungary. But the match in Budapest was overshadowed by actions in the crowd as black members of the England team were subjected to racist abuse. Nigel Adderley told me it is a depressingly familiar story.
During a number of matches in Eastern Europe over the past few years, there has been racist abuse. Those events in Budapest followed similar scenes in Podgorica during a match against Montenegro and also in Sofia. And I was there for the game against Bulgaria. There was orchestrated abuse towards black players and the perpetrators were bussed in and then were allowed to leave without any issue. And that was a stadium which had already been partially closed due to previous incidents. And it should also be pointed out, though, that players taking the knee has been booed before some domestic games in England recently, and there was that outpouring of racist comments online towards England players following that defeat in the Euro 2020 final.
Are the international football authorities taking this seriously? Because Hungary were already punished for actions during the Euros.
That is a very good point, because they were punished by UEFA, the people who run European football, because there were racist and homophobic incidents during Euro 2020, and they will be playing 3 games behind closed doors. But the England game last night is looked after by FIFA, the world governing body, so that punishment is yet to take effect. And FIFA had said today they will be taking adequate action following the scenes in Budapest. And both organisations do have very prominent anti-racism campaigns. They say they have a zero-tolerance approach. But a number of England players I've spoken to in recent years shrug their shoulders. They believe nothing will change because the punishments don't get to the heart of the issue. There needs to be long-term education within the countries where we see these racist incidents. But will that happen? We're not too sure. The Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has described players taking the knee as provocation, so it's unlikely he'll be condemning the scenes we saw last night.
Nigel Adderley. And still to come on the podcast.
I don't really miss being kicked in the head, but I can say that I do miss kicking people in the head. Until you've kicked someone, you just don't know the thrill you get out of it.
Para Taekwondo makes its debut at the Paralympics as the first full contact sport to feature in the Games. Now, he's only been in office for a year, but the Japanese Prime Minister, Yoshihide Suga, has announced he intends to step down after his approval ratings dropped to an all-time low. He said he wouldn't run for party leader because he needed to concentrate on dealing with the COVID outbreak, Japan's worst so far. Our Asia-Pacific editor Celia Hatton has been telling me more about the reasons for Mr. Suga's departure.
I think he probably just had a really long, hard look in the mirror and realized that it was very unlikely that he was going to be able to get the support of his party in order to head into another election. As you said, his approval ratings are so low among the public. Only around 30% of Japanese voters approve of him. That's down from 74% a year ago when he came into office. A lot of people refuse to accept Mr. Suga's argument that Japan's surge in the number of COVID cases, they had a record high of 25,000 cases in a day just at the end of August. Most people refuse to recognize Mr. Suga's argument that that is unrelated to the fact that Japan decided to go ahead with the Olympics and to devote so many resources to the Olympics. So as the number of COVID cases started climbing and we heard that hospitals in Japan were turning away COVID patients, really many people just pointed the finger at the Olympics and the Paralympics to say, look, this is the reason why our caseload is surging.
Celia Hatton. This week, the European Court of Human Rights decided that Russia failed to properly investigate the abduction and assassination in 2009 of the prominent activist Natalia Arstemirova. She worked for the Russian human rights group Memorial in the Chechen capital Grozny. She was kidnapped and shot in the head and chest. The court's ruling said there wasn't enough evidence to conclude that she'd been kidnapped by state agents, but that evidence in the case did cast doubt on the thoroughness of the Russian investigation. Her daughter, Lana Arstemirova, has been talking to the BBC.
When I saw those words, that there hasn't been enough evidence that the Russian authorities are responsible for the murder of my mother, it was shocking. It was a very shocking decision.
To inform our listeners, what kind of threats your mother was receiving, how and why you believe this was all state engineered?
I was a child, so I didn't know the full extent of the threats she received. I only learned about them after her murder. She received personal threats from Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of Chechnya, not once but twice, and she received threats from various Chechen authorities. So while the official Russian investigation states that she was killed by this militant, as far as I'm aware, she never received any threats from any of the militants or any of the terrorists. But because of the threats that she was receiving from the authorities, we were forced to spend stretches of time apart from each other because she was worried for my safety. We had to flee Chechnya twice. Over the last year of her life, I've probably seen her for about a month and a half.
The Russian authorities haven't responded to this report. They all along have always denied any kind of involvement in this. Can you remind us of the work your mother was doing in terms of what she and the organisation, the Human Rights Defenders, were doing in Chechen?
Well, there were two wars between Russia and Chechnya in the 90s and the early 2000s. And the second war was kind of presented as this anti-terrorist operation, but civilians always suffered the most. They were being kidnapped by special forces, tortured, forced to sign papers. There were mop-up operations where they would sweep through villages and kidnap any eligible young man from the age of 15 and 16. I have friends and relatives who have missing sons, whose parents were killed during the war. It's a very tragic story. And so my mother, as a representative of this human rights organization and her colleagues, they would go around those villages, they would collect all the testimonies, all the evidence. They would actually go to these military bases, and often they actually try to grab those innocent men from the hands of these Russian forces or later Kadyrov's forces. And at the same time, she actually helped to pass on this evidence to the ECHR because there were multiple cases. Yeah, I guess there was this really twisted irony there that then later she became the evidence.
Lana Arstemi-Rover talking to my colleague Bola Masuro. In Hollywood this weekend, the mood is likely to be gloomy as the final box office figures are tallied up at the end of the normally lucrative summer season. It's predicted that cinema revenues will be markedly down because of COVID-19. Tom Brooke in New York has this report.
Candyman. The horror film Candyman opened last month at the North American box office, and it did remarkably well. One bright spot in what was a very difficult American summer for cinemas. Comscore media analyst Paul Garabedian.
I've been doing this 30 years. This is the most challenging time. This is going to be a real shortfall compared to a traditional summer, which generates, in general, around $4 billion a year in North America, representing about 40% of the total year's box office. This year, we're going to be well down from that.
Too many moviegoers are staying at home, fearful that going to cinemas will expose them to COVID-19. This appears to be especially true for older Americans and for families with children. I met Brooklynite John Salters on the boardwalk by the ocean in Coney Island in New York. He hasn't been inclined to go to the cinema.
Netflix has been great, ever since quarantine. Anything too enclosed, too much forced air, not really feeling it.
Obviously, one of the main casualties of the weak box office has been cinemas themselves. Some have gone out of business. Particularly hard hit are art house cinemas. At Cinema Village in New York's Greenwich Village, Harry Nicolau confirms it's been difficult to bring in moviegoers.
It's hard to get people out their homes and come here and watch movies. I mean, for weeks we've run specials like $5 tickets, and you can watch as many movies as you want. And the response has not been overwhelmingly positive, but it's hard to compete with the convenience of sitting on your couch.
His call sign's Taskmaster.
The crowds might be thinner, but significant numbers have gone to cinemas this summer. Among the top-grossing films were Marvel's action spy thriller Black Widow, F9, the latest installment of the Fast and Furious franchise, and the horror film A Quiet Place Part 2. Audiences who did make it to cinemas were very appreciative.
We've gone to the movies a couple of times, and we've seen pretty good crowds going in, and people seem happy to be there again.
As Hollywood's precarious summer movie season draws to a close, the film industry is hoping that COVID-19 will subside and that movie fans will return to cinemas to feast on a slew of big autumnal titles. Many cinema owners are pinning their hopes on British secret agent 007 to save the day.
Where's 007?
That report by Tom Brooke. Time now for news from elsewhere. Our weekly look at some of the less reported stories from around the world. And I'm joined by Jen Monaghan from BBC Monitoring. And we start, Jen, with the Russian sushi chain that's been targeted by hoax bomb threats.
Bomb threats and sushi are not phrases you normally hear in the same sentence. But there have actually been two sushi chains targeted in Russia by a right-wing online community called Men's State. This all started earlier this month when a sushi delivery firm called Yobby da Yobby used black models in its promotional material. This did not go down well with Men's State, which loosely defined as a collection of anti-women, anti-LGBT and anti-minorities individuals. The founder of Men's State called on supporters to bombard Yobby with negative feedback and fake orders. This week, the company issued a statement apologising for offending Russian people with its photos. The next target for Men's State was another chain of sushi restaurants called Tanuki, which used black models and a rainbow flag in its promotional materials. This led Men's State founder Vladislav Pozniakov to accuse Tanuki of imposing alien values on the Russian people. The following day, all Tanuki restaurants in Moscow were targeted by hoax bomb threats, though Pozniakov has denied any involvement. It's important to say there has been online support for the chain. Some social media users have praised the company and ridiculed Men's State, but they've received less support from the top, with the Kremlin opting not to comment on the issue.
And from Men's State to women's cafes, and state media in China is highlighting a new phenomenon whereby women pay to enjoy the company of men who listen to them.
Yes, so this is the story of so-called butlers cafes, as they're known. Essentially, Chinese women who are fed up of being ignored by their partners or who just want a bit of company are now paying for the privilege of being waited on by attentive male servers. This could involve simply having a chat, watching films or even playing games. Chinese society remains patriarchal, so many of the women who go to the cafes enjoy the feeling of empowerment that it gives them.
Now, I understand these butler cafes originally come from Japan, and that's where your final story comes from, but it'll strike a chord with anyone looking ahead to the start of the new school year.
Yes, it's back to school time, and one school in suburban Tokyo has welcomed its pupils back by covering all 29 of its blackboards in chalk art. The images are absolutely fantastic, intricate swirls, images of dolphins, birds, flowers and other beautiful things. According to Japanese media, around 60 local artists got together to paint the boards in order to lift the spirits of children who haven't been able to study or play normally because of the pandemic.
Thank you very much to Jen Monaghan. And we stay in Japan for the final item of the podcast, and another sport is making its debut at the Paralympics in Tokyo. Para-taekwondo, the first full contact sport ever to feature at the Games. Kira Forsyth is a Paralympic taekwondo hopeful for Paris 2024. Before she had a terrible accident, Kira used to compete in taekwondo for the able-bodied, which, unlike para-taekwondo, allows contestants to kick each other's heads. The BBC's Nick Robinson asked her what she thinks of the difference.
I don't really miss being kicked in the head, but I can say that I do miss kicking people in the head.
Yes, well, it doesn't sound that nice, does it? Kicking the head, and punches to the body are not marked, I think I'm right in saying, aren't I, in the Paralympics?
Yeah.
For the rather obvious reason that you've got less ability to protect yourself, is that right?
Yeah, so it's some of the athletes don't have either of their arms or they've got limited use, so it's just seen as unsafe.
Just explain, Kira, to people listening who might just be wincing at the thought of all this kicking and punching, why, as a sport, you both enjoy it but think it's good to watch.
I think it's one of the best spectator sports. If you watch the Olympics, you can see that it takes seconds for the whole match to change and medals to be won or lost. Until you've kicked someone, you just don't know the thrill you get out of it.
Now, Kira, as I explained, you were a competitor in Taekwondo before you had a terrible accident and ended up asking doctors to amputate your arm because you were in so much pain.
I broke my arm about 9 years ago, walking my dog, and it chased a squirrel, took me with it. And then it set off a really rare autoimmune disease that I didn't know I'd been born with, and it's rated the worst pain condition in the world. I opted to have it off, and it was the best thing I ever did.
And your campaign, I know, for disability rights, joke that Stumpy is always with you.
Yeah, so I call my left arm Stumpy. I think it's more accessible to people and children, and I say now he's my lifelong companion. We go everywhere together.
And how important is sport? How important are the Paralympics?
I think it's hugely important. Disability for a very long time has been seen as a sort of weakness. And I think the Paralympic highlights the amazing things you can do as well as having a disability. Like, it doesn't limit people as much as people assume it does.
Para-taekwondo hopeful Kira Forsyth. And that's all from us for now, but we'll be back with more global news later. This podcast was produced by Alison Davis and mixed by Ash Taylor. Our editor is Karen Martin. I'm Oliver Conway. Until next time, goodbye.
Hi, this is Benjamin from the UK true crime podcast They Walk Among Us. Want to see something scary? Shudder is the ultimate streaming service for fans of horror, thrillers, and the supernatural. Shudder offers an unbeatable selection from Hollywood favorites and cult classics to original series and critically acclaimed new genre films you won't find anywhere else. Explore the best collection of horror that pushes boundaries, showcases bold original storytelling, and offers something new to watch every week. Available ad-free, on demand, and through the platforms you're already on. Shudder. So good it's scary. Sign up at shudder.com.